I still remember the first time I saw him standing by our front door. My husband had hired him without asking my opinion, claiming we needed help with the baby because his work schedule was becoming impossible. He said it with that tone he always used when a decision had already been made, and my input was more a courtesy than a necessity. The man who stood there wasn't what I expected at all. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, dressed simply in jeans and a plain t-shirt, with a calmness in his posture that made him seem almost too comfortable for someone stepping into a stranger's home for the first time. His smile was soft but confident, his eyes steady. He introduced himself, extended his hand politely, and I shook it before I could fully process the small shock of how warm and firm his grip was. I had never imagined a male nanny. It felt unnatural at first. Not because he was a man, but because of the ease with which he moved through the house, as if he'd always belonged there. He knelt on the floor, immediately engaging with my daughter, speaking to her in that gentle, patient way that children respond to without question. She smiled, reaching out for him within minutes. And somehow, that disarmed me more than anything else could have. My husband was pleased. I could see it in the way he clapped the man on the shoulder, already acting like they were old friends. I just stood there, watching the three of them, feeling like the outsider in my own kitchen. At first, I tried to keep my distance. I told myself that this was simply someone doing a job, but over the next few days, I couldn't help but notice things. The way he always asked if I needed anything when he saw me struggling with groceries. The way he picked up on my daughter's moods faster than I did sometimes. The way he listened, really listened, when I answered his casual questions about how my day was going. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't dramatic. It was in the quiet spaces, the pauses between words, the small, unspoken acknowledgments that most people are too busy to give. One afternoon, while my husband was at work, I found myself sitting on the floor in the living room, folding laundry while he played with my daughter just a few feet away. I shouldn't have been paying attention to him, but I was. Watching how easily he made her laugh, how natural it looked, how right. I don't know why I said it. I didn't plan to. But the words came out before I could catch them. You're really good with her. He turned his head slightly, smiled again, that same calm expression. Thank you. She's a great kid. Simple, innocent. But the way his eyes held mine for just a second too long, I felt it. A current, subtle but undeniable, passing between us. I looked away first, back to the socks and tiny shirts in my hands. My fingers were clumsy suddenly, folding slower than before. That night, lying beside my husband, his back already turned to me, breathing deep and steady in sleep, I stared at the ceiling for hours. My body next to his, but my mind wandering to places it had no right to go. It was too soon to call it anything. Too soon to admit even to myself that I noticed. But the seed had been planted, and I knew, long before I could admit it out loud, that something inside me had already shifted. The days that followed moved quietly, predictably. Breakfasts, naps, the soft hum of cartoons in the background while I cleaned the kitchen or answered emails. He was always there. Not intrusive, never too present, but never fully out of sight. I told myself I was imagining the small flickers of attention between us. A shared glance when my husband wasn't looking. A polite exchange of words that somehow felt heavier than they should. It was the middle of the week, sometime after lunch. My daughter had fallen asleep early, exhausted from the park, and the house had settled into that rare, peaceful hush. I stayed in the kitchen, wiping down the counters though they were already clean, just to give my hands something to do. He came in quietly, almost as if he sensed I was avoiding the silence. Do you want some coffee? His voice broke the stillness without disturbing it. I nodded without turning to face him, hearing the soft clink of the mugs as he reached for them. It should have been nothing. Two adults sharing coffee in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. But I felt my pulse quicken, that irritating awareness of my own body, my skin hyper-aware of how close he stood behind me as he poured. I reached for the cup he offered, our fingers brushing lightly. Neither of us pulled away too fast. There was a moment, too brief to be deliberate, too long to ignore, where our eyes met. I should have said something. I should have laughed it off, made some casual remark to break whatever that was. But I didn't. Instead, I felt the weight of his gaze settle on me as I leaned back against the counter, taking a slow sip, avoiding eye contact, as if pretending not to notice would make the tension less real. Then, as if the moment demanded more, he stepped closer. Barely a shift in distance, but enough that the air between us felt too thin. His hand brushed lightly against my hip, almost as if by mistake, and my body betrayed me before my mind could catch up. I didn't stop him. I didn't step away. My lips met his. Quick, unplanned, a clumsy collision of want and confusion. His hand came up instinctively to the side of my face, and I let the kiss linger half a breath longer than I should have before I pulled away. The space between us felt charged, dangerous. He stood still, watching me, waiting. But I didn't explain myself. I couldn't. I left the kitchen, my coffee untouched on the counter, my heart pounding so loud I wondered if he could hear it as I walked away. I didn't look back. But I wanted to. God, I wanted to. I barely slept that night. My body lay still beside my husband, but my mind wouldn't quiet down. Over and over, I replayed the kiss in my head. The softness of his lips, the steadiness of his hand against my cheek, the terrifying ease of how natural it had felt. I told myself it had been a mistake, an impulse, something that would pass. But beneath all that rationalizing was the truth I didn't want to say out loud. I had wanted it. I had wanted it long before it happened. The next morning, everything looked the same. My husband reading emails over coffee, my daughter playing on the rug, the nanny moving through the house as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't meet his eyes. Not fully. Every time I caught even the edge of his gaze, my stomach tightened. I felt like I was walking through the day wrapped in static electricity, waiting for the next spark. It wasn't him who broke the silence. It was my husband, cheerful as ever, mentioning a weekend trip he'd been planning for us. A small hotel outside the city, a couple of nights away to unplug, as he put it. He wanted the nanny to come along, to help with the baby, make it easier for us to relax. I nodded, my mouth dry. I could feel the weight of the nanny's glance from across the room, brief but unmistakable. He didn't protest. He agreed politely, offering that calm, agreeable tone he always used. But I saw the flicker behind his expression. A question, a challenge, something daring me to acknowledge what had passed between us. In the days that followed, I pretended to settle into the plan. I packed bags, made lists, checked weather forecasts, but every small task felt like acting. Beneath each folded sweater, every zipped-up suitcase, there was a different preparation happening, a readiness I wasn't willing to name yet, but couldn't deny. The drive to the hotel was quiet. My husband, as always, handled the logistics. The baby dozed in her car seat, and I sat in the back, squeezed between the two of them. Too close. His thigh brushing against mine just enough to remind me of the kiss I wasn't supposed to remember. I held my breath for longer stretches than I should have, focusing on the blur of the trees outside the window, trying not to give myself away. At the hotel, everything was too perfect. The bright lobby, the soft music, the polite smiles at check-in. My husband chatted easily with the staff, arranging dinner reservations, talking about the pool, about the spa. I stood there nodding, my hands folded neatly in front of me, while my chest felt tight enough to snap. That evening, after we'd put the baby down in the adjoining room, my husband suggested drinks in the bar downstairs. He was tired, though, barely making it through one glass of wine before excusing himself, saying he wanted to get some rest. He told me to stay, to enjoy myself, gesturing toward the half-empty lounge as if inviting me to be free. I stayed. Of course I stayed. The nanny was already seated by the far window, alone, a whiskey in his hand, watching the streetlights through the glass. When I walked over, he didn't move. He just looked up at me slowly, his eyes steady and unreadable. "You're not going to pretend that didn't happen, are you?" The words were quiet, almost gentle, but they struck harder than they should have. I sat down across from him, my heart beat loud enough to drown out the music playing softly overhead. I should have stood up and walked away. I should have shaken my head, told him he was wrong, that it was nothing, that it had meant nothing. But my body didn't move. I sat there, my hands resting too calmly on my lap, my gaze fixed on the rim of my wine glass like it held some kind of answer I couldn't find in myself. The hotel bar wasn't crowded. A few couples leaning in close at their tables, the occasional clink of glassware, soft murmurs from the far end of the room. Outside the window, the rain had started, painting blurry silver lines down the black surface of the street. It was the kind of night that felt like a closed door, quiet, sealed, holding everything inside. "I'm not pretending anything," I answered finally, my voice lower than I meant it to be. He leaned back slightly, eyes not leaving mine. There was no accusation in his face, no demand. Only that unsettling calm, the same patience I'd seen in him since the beginning. The same patience that made me feel too exposed. "I wasn't planning on this," I added after a moment, though the words tasted thin, unconvincing. Because deep down, I knew I had been craving attention long before this. Not the attention that comes from gifts or polite gestures. The kind that sees you. The kind that looks past the roles you play. Wife, mother, hostess, and touches the part of you that you keep buried. He nodded once, not pushing, not asking for more. That restraint made it worse. It made me want to confess things I didn't even know I was ready to say. I finished my glass too quickly, the burn of the wine making my throat ache. When I stood to leave, he stood too. Not following, not reaching, just standing there, watching. The hallway back to the room felt endless. Each step slower than the last, my breath held tight in my chest. I half expected him to call after me, to close the distance between us, to say something that would force my hand. But he didn't. I slipped into the room as quietly as I could. My husband was already asleep, his face softened by the dim light from the hallway, the television playing quietly in the background. I sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the carpet, my pulse still hammering against my ribs. When sleep finally came, it was shallow, restless. I woke before dawn, the pale blue of the morning pressing at the edges of the curtains. In the other room, my daughter stirred softly in her crib. My husband, undisturbed, shifted onto his side, pulling the covers closer. I stood at the window, arms crossed tight over my chest, watching the slow crawl of headlights on the wet street below. I wasn't sure if I felt guilt. It wasn't that simple. It wasn't shame or regret. It was hunger. That aching, dangerous hunger that rises when you've tasted something you were never meant to have, and realize that once is never enough. And as I stood there, listening to the silence of the early morning, I knew one thing with terrifying certainty. This was not over. Not even close. The rain didn't stop the next day. It drummed steadily against the hotel windows, soft enough to be calming, loud enough to fill the space between words. We spent the morning moving through the slow routine of vacation life. Breakfast in the lounge, cartoons playing low on the TV, my husband scrolling through his phone while half listening to my daughter's chatter. I watched him, watched the ease with which he settled into the day, his mind already on work emails even here. He kissed me on the cheek, distracted but affectionate, and excused himself for a conference call he couldn't postpone. The hotel room door clicked shut behind him. Silence settled again. The nanny stayed with my daughter, kneeling beside her as they stacked blocks on the rug. I sat nearby, pretending to scroll through my own messages, though my eyes kept drifting back to them. Every movement of his hands, the way he leaned in to listen, the softness in his voice when he spoke to her, all of it too steady, too easy. He wasn't just good at his job. He was good at reading people, and he read me like an open book. When my daughter finally drifted into her afternoon nap, I stood, meaning to step outside, maybe clear my head. But the moment my hand touched the door handle, I felt his presence behind me. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of him before I turned. "You're not sleeping either, are you?" His voice was low, not a question, more a recognition of what was already known. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My fingers tightened on the handle, but I didn't pull the door open. Instead, I turned to face him fully. No one spoke. The space between us filled quickly with everything unspoken, the weight of the night before still pressing down on both of us. He stepped forward first. Slow, deliberate. His hand reached up, brushing lightly against my jaw, fingertips tracing the line beneath my ear, so soft it felt like breath. I didn't stop him. I didn't want to. This time the kiss wasn't clumsy, wasn't accidental. It was quiet, deep, certain. His lips found mine with the confidence of someone who knew I wouldn't pull away. And I didn't. I let him kiss me because I wanted to feel that again. The pull, the rush of blood beneath my skin, the way my body leaned into his without permission from my mind. His hands didn't roam, didn't rush. They held my face gently, almost reverently, as if he understood that what I needed wasn't force, but focus, to be the center of someone's touch, completely. When I finally pulled back, breathless, I didn't apologize. Neither did he. There was nothing frantic in the way we stood there, just the heavy truth of what had happened between us. Again. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint hum of my husband's voice from the other room, pacing through his call, oblivious. The nanny's eyes stayed on mine. Calm, steady, waiting for me to decide what would happen next. But the decision had already been made the moment I didn't stop him. The ride back home felt longer than it should have. My husband was in good spirits, talking about the week ahead, making plans for dinners, meetings, the usual juggling act of work and family life. I sat in the passenger seat, nodding at the right moments, offering the right smiles while my mind stayed trapped somewhere between the memory of his hand on my face and the taste of his lips still lingering on mine. In the back seat, my daughter napped peacefully, her small head tilted to the side, oblivious to the storm brewing just inches away from her quiet world. And beside her, the nanny remained silent, looking out the window, his posture as relaxed as ever. But I knew. I could feel it. The electricity humming between us hadn't dulled. If anything, the distance only sharpened it. When we pulled into the driveway, life resumed its expected rhythm with almost cruel precision. Groceries to unpack, bags to carry inside, toys scattered across the floor like nothing had shifted beneath the surface. My husband kissed me on the forehead before heading upstairs to catch up on work calls, leaving me alone again in the kitchen. I moved through the motions, folding laundry, refilling the fridge, answering emails. Every task mechanical, my hands steady, my mind anything but. I could feel the ache of the choices I wasn't making aloud. The decisions that were happening between glances, in the pause before a word, in the heat beneath my skin when his hand brushed too close to mine. The next few days became a quiet battle between the life I was supposed to live and the pull I couldn't silence. I dressed more carefully than before, even at home, choosing softer fabrics, silk under thin sweaters, lace beneath everyday dresses. Not for my husband. He rarely noticed, but for the way I caught the nanny's eyes lingering on the curve of my shoulder when I leaned across the counter, the way his glance hesitated just enough to speak volumes. It wasn't about seduction. It was something heavier, slower, more dangerous. The kind of attraction that builds weight with each unspoken sentence, every small touch that holds too long. We didn't speak about the kiss again. Not directly. But every shared space became a quiet confession. There was a moment one evening, the baby asleep, my husband locked in his office upstairs. I stood at the sink, rinsing plates, and felt him behind me. Close, but not too close. His presence enough to make the air between us feel too tight. "You don't seem yourself lately," he said, voice even, careful. I swallowed hard, my hands still in the water, eyes fixed on the window above the sink. Maybe I'm just tired. The lie tasted bitter. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence held the question between us, and my refusal to meet his gaze gave him the answer. But neither of us stepped away. It wasn't planned. None of it ever was. That was the worst part. How easy it became to drift toward him. How natural the pull felt, even when my mind screamed at me to stop. My husband's business trip came up on short notice. 3 nights away, back-to-back meetings, the kind of schedule he loved, the kind that made him feel important. He told me at dinner, between bites of roast chicken and distracted glances at his phone. I nodded, listening, agreeing that of course I'd manage everything at home, that it would be fine. The nanny sat quietly across from me at the table, helping my daughter with her spoon, smiling gently when she made a mess of her food. He didn't look at me directly, but he didn't have to. The awareness between us had become its own language. When my husband left the next morning, I stood at the door, kissed him goodbye, wished him luck. I played the part as smoothly as I ever had, my smile soft, my tone affectionate. But beneath it, my body hummed with a different anticipation. A darker one. By noon, the routine of the house fell into place. The baby's nap, the cleaning, the quiet shuffle of domestic life filling the spaces between minutes. I moved through it all with the same practiced grace, but my skin felt too tight. My breath shallow beneath the weight of everything unsaid. The suggestion came from me. Casual, almost careless. If it's too late when you're done with her bedtime, you can stay in the guest room tonight. It's silly to drive back and forth. I watched him closely as I said it, searching for the flicker of reaction behind his calm expression. But he only nodded once. Easy, polite. Not giving me the satisfaction of a visible response. The evening stretched long and soft. Dinner, bath time, bedtime stories. My daughter drifted off without a fight, the house sinking into the kind of stillness that feels heavier than silence. I stayed in the kitchen, wiping down counters that didn't need cleaning, waiting, listening. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Slow, measured, each step deliberate. When he came into the room, he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. We stood facing each other, the space between us thinner than breath. I could feel the pulse in my neck, sharp, relentless. My hands rested flat against the edge of the counter, holding me steady. I shouldn't have offered, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. But you did. His reply was soft, even. No accusation, no blame. Just truth, spoken out loud. I should have told him to go. I should have turned away, walked upstairs, buried myself beneath the safety of my marriage vows. But my feet didn't move. I let him step closer. Let his hand rest gently at my waist, fingers light, waiting for permission I was too weak to deny. The kiss this time wasn't fast or clumsy. It was slow, intentional. His lips finding mine like they belonged there, like they had every right to be there. And I let him. Again. The days that followed blurred into something I could no longer name. Nothing exploded. Nothing obvious broke. But under the surface, the shift had already happened. There was no undoing the line we'd crossed, and neither of us tried to pretend otherwise. He stayed the night in the guest room, just as I'd suggested, just as I'd wanted. In the morning, he was up early, helping with breakfast, calm and steady, his voice gentle as he spoke to my daughter while she tossed cereal pieces across the table. I moved through the motions of the day with him close, too close, every glance between us thick with memory, every quiet pause between words heavy with the weight of what we weren't saying. The strangest part was how easy it became to live in both worlds. The routine didn't change. The diapers, the dishes, the grocery lists, they all remained in place, anchors holding the shape of my life together while my mind wandered somewhere else entirely. I kissed my husband when he returned from his trip, listened to his stories about meetings and delayed flights, smiled at the right moments. But the touches between us felt more distant than ever, even when he reached for my hand at dinner or wrapped an arm around my waist as we stood together at the sink. It wasn't guilt that filled the space between me and my husband. It was something worse. Indifference. A growing awareness of how easily he'd stopped looking at me, really looking, years before any of this began. The nanny didn't push. He didn't corner me, didn't force the next step, but he didn't avoid me either. His presence was constant, patient, like a quiet answer waiting for a question I wasn't brave enough to ask out loud. One afternoon, while my daughter napped upstairs, I found myself outside on the back patio, the soft hum of summer heat pressing against my skin. He stepped out a few minutes later, 2 glasses of iced tea in hand, offering me one without a word. I took it, our fingers brushing again, too familiar by now to call accidental. We sat there in the thick quiet of the afternoon, the air between us buzzing with everything we weren't saying. "I never meant for this to happen," I said, my voice softer than I expected, almost as if the words weren't mine. "Neither did I," he answered. "It should have ended there. That would have been the place for it to stop, to pull back, to set the boundary." But instead, I looked at him, really looked, and felt my chest tighten with the ache of wanting. Not just the wanting of flesh, but the wanting of being seen, of being known, completely. His gaze held steady on mine, and for the first time I realized he understood. Not just the desire, but the loneliness beneath it. The ache of waiting years for someone to notice you're starving. That night, after the house had gone still, I found myself standing outside the guest room door, my hand hovering near the handle. My breath was shallow, my heart racing beneath the thin silk of my nightgown. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. The door opened before I touched it. I stood there frozen, my hands still hovering midair, caught between the impulse to flee and the weight of everything that had brought me to this exact moment. His eyes met mine, calm as ever, waiting for me to be the one to speak, to choose, to either retreat or stay. I didn't retreat. The house behind me was silent, cloaked in the soft breath of sleep. Upstairs, my husband lay peacefully unaware, the steady rhythm of his presence filling the master bedroom like a wall I had already begun to step through. My daughter, safe in her crib, wrapped in dreams as innocent as the life I pretended to hold together so effortlessly. But I wasn't effortless anymore. I moved first. I didn't ask. I didn't need permission. I stepped into the guest room, the soft creak of the door closing behind me louder in my head than it was in the air. The thin cotton of my nightgown did nothing to shield me from the way his eyes held me there, standing in the middle of the room, exposed in ways that had nothing to do with clothing. I wanted to hate myself for how natural it felt, but I couldn't. I wanted to tell myself I was drunk on loneliness, on months of quiet dismissal, on years of soft, polite neglect that had worn my skin thin. But that wasn't it either. The truth was worse than that. The truth was that I had wanted this before I knew I wanted it. That the hunger had been living beneath my ribs for longer than I cared to admit. He didn't rush toward me. That was never his way. His presence alone was enough to close the distance, and when he reached for me, it was gentle, deliberate. His hand slid slowly along my jaw, his thumb tracing the edge of my cheek as if I might shatter under the weight of too much urgency. But urgency was all I had. I leaned into his touch like someone starved for air. When his lips met mine again, it was with the kind of certainty that leaves no space for apology. I kissed him back harder than I meant to, my fingers knotting into the fabric of his t-shirt, pulling him closer, as if closing that last inch between us might stop the ache in my chest. It didn't. The kiss broke only when breath demanded it. My forehead pressed to his, my hands still gripping him like an anchor. I didn't speak. Words felt too small for what was happening between us. In the soft dark of that room, with only the faint hum of the house as witness, I felt the shift inside me settle into something permanent. There would be no returning from this, no unwinding of the threads we'd tied between our bodies. When I finally stepped back, I saw it in his eyes. Not regret, not doubt, but the same quiet need that I felt thrumming beneath my own skin. He didn't ask me to stay. He didn't have to. I turned, slipped out the door, the air thick around me. the heat of his touch still burning against my lips. The hallway back to my own bedroom had never felt so long. The weight of what I carried with me into that silence heavier than I thought I could hold. But I held it. And I knew I would come back.